We've all heard the phrase, "No one is perfect." But let's be honest, relationships can test that belief more than anything else. Friends forget promises. Family members let us down. People argue, overstep, or fail to meet expectations. It's easy to reach a breaking point where cutting ties feels like the simplest solution. But is it the wisest? The Stoics would argue, no. Stoic philosophy reminds us that relationships, like life itself, are inherently messy. People act from ignorance, insecurity, or their own inner struggles, just as we do. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If someone is mistaken, kindly teach them and show them the truth. But if you cannot, blame yourself or no one." This is the heart of Stoic wisdom, seeing others' flaws, not as reasons for resentment, but as opportunities to practice understanding, patience, and virtue. Yet, let's not confuse this with tolerating harmful relationships or excusing toxic behavior. The Stoics were clear, your peace of mind matters, but walking away should never be an impulsive reaction to discomfort. It should be a thoughtful choice rooted in reason and guided by virtue. Cutting ties is not inherently wrong, but how and why you do it can make all the difference. In this video, we'll explore 9 common excuses people use to cut ties with family and friends, and why these excuses might be worth rethinking. By examining each scenario through the lens of Stoic philosophy, we'll uncover how to navigate difficult relationships with wisdom, empathy, and clarity. And while we're at it, we'll double our efforts to address and hopefully reverse the damage done by fake Stoicism through videos that fool you into thinking that Stoicism tells you 9 signs you should cut ties, even with family or friends. It doesn't. Because that stuff is for immature and judgmental people who don't have the patience to entertain differing perspectives. But you're not them. You have a patient ear and a steady heart. So, watch the video till the end, and when you've done that, go to the comments section and tell me how you feel. I read every comment, and I do that because your thoughts are important to me. And if the virtue in you appreciates this calling, help us reach others like you. You can do that by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video, especially by sharing this video. The true measure of our character isn't how we act when relationships are easy, it's how we respond when they challenge us. So, before you walk away from a relationship that's testing your limits, pause, reflect. Let the Stoics guide you to a decision that aligns not just with your emotions, but with your highest self. 1. People who don't spend money. Have you ever been in a relationship where money seemed to define the dynamic? Not because of poverty or genuine need, but because of a pattern that left you feeling undervalued. Maybe you've had a friend who never hesitated to spend on their hobbies or luxuries, but always seemed to have a financial excuse when it came to shared plans. It's easy to jump to conclusions, to see this as a sign of disrespect or calculated behavior, but the Stoics remind us to approach such situations with reason, compassion, and virtue, not resentment or transactional thinking. I once had a friend, Tom, who often declined outings or group plans, citing financial concerns. At first, I didn't think much of it, but over time, I started noticing a pattern. While he was quick to say no to shared expenses, he had no hesitation in treating himself to expensive gadgets or trips. It felt imbalanced. I began to wonder, am I being taken for granted? Does he value this friendship the way I do? Initially, I was frustrated. I considered stepping back from the friendship entirely, but the Stoics teach us to pause and reflect, to avoid rushing into judgments about someone's intent. Marcus Aurelius advises us to be tolerant with others and strict with yourself. Instead of labeling Tom's behavior as selfish, I asked myself, what can I observe without assumption? I realized that while money was one aspect of our dynamic, it didn't define the entire relationship. Tom often showed care in other ways, offering his time, advice, and support when I needed it. The imbalance I felt wasn't about his financial choices, but about my own expectations. This is where the Stoics offer profound insight. They caution against transactional thinking in relationships, urging us to act virtuously without expecting reciprocity. If I chose to spend on shared experiences, that decision should reflect my values, not an unspoken expectation of equal contribution. The Stoics emphasize justice and fairness, but they also remind us that we are not entitled to specific outcomes. Tom's choices were outside my control. What was within my control was how I chose to respond, with resentment or with understanding. Rather than cutting ties, I chose to address the imbalance thoughtfully. During a casual conversation, I mentioned how much I valued our friendship and shared experiences, but also expressed that I sometimes felt uncertain about how we approached shared plans. To my surprise, Tom was receptive. He admitted that he struggled with prioritizing shared expenses and hadn't realized how his choices might come across. That conversation deepened our understanding of each other and strengthened our friendship. The Stoics would argue that this approach aligns with virtue, seeking fairness and clarity while maintaining goodwill. Cutting ties over money alone would have been hasty and rooted in emotion rather than reason. By addressing the issue with respect and compassion, I preserved the relationship while also ensuring that my actions reflected my values. However, there's another layer to consider. While the Stoics advocate for generosity and understanding, they also emphasize boundaries rooted in virtue. If a relationship consistently undermines your ability to act justly, wisely, or courageously, it's reasonable to reevaluate its place in your life. But even then, the decision to step away should come from a place of rational self-respect, not frustration or entitlement. Looking back, my experience with Tom taught me that relationships aren't defined solely by financial contributions or reciprocity. They're about mutual respect, shared values, and the intention behind our actions. The Stoics remind us to give freely, to act virtuously, and to accept what is beyond our control, including the behavior of others. So, if you find yourself in a similar situation, pause and reflect. Ask yourself, is this imbalance truly about money, or is it about something deeper? My expectations, their circumstances, or our communication? Approach the relationship with clarity and goodwill. If you can address the issue constructively, do so. If not, consider whether the relationship aligns with your values and your capacity to act virtuously. 2. People who often quarrel and take sides. Have you ever felt trapped in a relationship where every discussion spirals into a debate and every minor disagreement turns into a battlefield? Dealing with someone who often quarrels or forces you to take sides can feel exhausting, even maddening. But the Stoics teach us a different way to approach such situations, one rooted not in frustration or avoidance, but in reason, patience, and a commitment to virtuous engagement. Let me share a story that reshaped how I deal with such dynamics. I once had a colleague, James, who seemed to thrive on debate. At first, I admired his confidence and quick thinking, but over time, I noticed a pattern. James wasn't just debating ideas, he was escalating disagreements into conflicts. One day, during a team meeting, a minor disagreement over project timelines blew up into a heated exchange. James, frustrated that others didn't immediately back his viewpoint, turned to me and said, "Don't you agree with me? Tell them I'm right." At that moment, I felt cornered. I didn't fully agree with James, but refusing to support him risked making the situation worse. It would have been easy to dismiss him as argumentative or selfish and distance myself. But the Stoic principles I'd been studying offered a better way. Instead of reacting emotionally, I paused, gathered my thoughts, and responded calmly. I said, "James, I think there are valid points on both sides. Let's step back and see if we can find common ground instead of dividing the team." To my surprise, the room quieted. James didn't immediately back down, but my response shifted the tone of the discussion. It wasn't about taking sides or avoiding the argument altogether. It was about redirecting the focus to reason and understanding. This experience taught me a valuable Stoic lesson. People who frequently quarrel or take sides are often acting out of insecurity, frustration, or a lack of self-control, not malice. Marcus Aurelius reminds us to bear in mind that the measure of a man is the worth of the things he cares about. In James's case, his arguments weren't about the issues themselves. They were about his need to feel validated and respected. Understanding this allowed me to approach him with compassion rather than resentment. The Stoics don't see excessive arguing as a moral failing, but as a failure of reasoning. Instead of cutting ties with James or labeling him as toxic, I chose to engage constructively. I began addressing disagreements with calm logic, steering conversations toward solutions rather than conflict. Over time, James's tendency to escalate debates diminished, not completely, but enough to improve our working relationship. But the Stoics also teach us that there are limits. While patience and reason should guide our actions, we are not obligated to endure behavior that consistently undermines our peace or our ability to act virtuously. If someone's constant quarrels make constructive engagement impossible, then stepping back may become necessary, not out of frustration or avoidance, but as a rational choice to preserve your ability to live justly and wisely. The key is to ensure that disengagement is a last resort, taken only after sincere efforts to address the behavior have been made. When I realized that James's arguments weren't entirely rooted in reason, I didn't cut ties. I adjusted my approach. I chose not to be drawn into unnecessary conflicts or take sides in debates where no resolution was possible. Instead, I focused on maintaining my own composure and offering constructive input where it was most needed. The Stoics remind us that inner peace is a byproduct of virtuous living, not the goal itself. Avoiding James entirely might have safeguarded my immediate sense of calm, but it wouldn't have aligned with justice, courage, or wisdom. Engaging with him constructively, even when it was challenging, allowed me to uphold those virtues and fostered a better dynamic over time. So, what can you do if you find yourself dealing with someone like James? First, approach the situation with curiosity and compassion. What's driving their behavior? Are they seeking validation, struggling with insecurity, or simply unaware of how their actions affect others? Understanding their motivations can help you respond calmly and rationally. Second, focus on steering the conversation toward reason. Quarrels often escalate because they become emotionally charged. By grounding the discussion in logic and seeking common ground, you can diffuse tension and create a more productive dialogue. Finally, know your limits. If a relationship constantly disrupts your ability to act virtuously, disengagement may be necessary. But even then, the Stoics would advise doing so with goodwill, not resentment. Recognize that their behavior is outside your control. What matters is how you choose to respond. The Stoic path isn't about avoiding difficult people or situations. It's about navigating them with wisdom, patience, and self-control. 3. People who take other people's worries lightly. In life, we each carry burdens that are uniquely shaped by our experiences. No two are alike, and they cannot be measured against one another. Yet, one of the most painful moments we can encounter is when we share our struggles with someone, only to feel that they dismiss or trivialize them. At first glance, this behavior might seem disrespectful or indifferent, but the Stoics urge us to look deeper, to approach such moments with understanding, patience, and reason, rather than judgment or resentment. I learned this lesson through a personal experience that stayed with me for years. During a particularly stressful time, I confided in a close friend, Emily, about the challenges of managing a demanding job while also supporting a family member who was going through a serious health crisis. It wasn't easy to open up, but I hoped for some empathy or even just a listening ear. Instead, Emily responded with a casual shrug and shifted the conversation to her own struggles, focusing on a recent disagreement she'd had with a coworker. At that moment, I felt dismissed and hurt, as though my worries didn't matter. My first instinct was to withdraw, to label Emily as self-absorbed and decide she wasn't someone I could trust. But as I reflected later, I realized that her reaction might not have been about me at all. Perhaps she didn't know how to respond or was overwhelmed by her own concerns. Maybe she lacked the tools to offer empathy in that moment. Marcus Aurelius teaches us to consider the struggles and limitations of others, reminding us that their behavior often reflects their internal state, not a deliberate intent to harm. Instead of letting resentment fester, I decided to approach the situation differently. The next time we spoke, I brought up how I felt, not confrontationally, but with openness and honesty. I said, "I know we both have a lot on our plates, but when I shared something personal the other day, I felt like it didn't land with you the way I hoped it would." To my surprise, Emily apologized. She admitted she hadn't realized how dismissive she'd seemed and explained that she'd been distracted by her own stress. That conversation strengthened our friendship and taught me the value of addressing issues constructively rather than jumping to conclusions. The Stoics remind us that relationships aren't about finding perfect people who always meet our expectations. They're about practicing patience, compassion, and understanding, qualities that build stronger connections and reflect our commitment to virtue. While it's easy to judge someone who takes others' worries lightly, the Stoics caution against assuming their behavior stems from malice. Instead, they encourage us to approach such moments as opportunities to foster mutual understanding. Of course, there are limits. The Stoics are clear that relationships should support our ability to act virtuously, not compromise it. If someone consistently dismisses your concerns, undermines your peace of mind, or shows no willingness to engage in a balanced, respectful dynamic, it may be time to reconsider the relationship. But even then, disengagement should be a thoughtful, last resort decision, never an emotional reaction to disappointment. The key is to focus on your own responses rather than trying to control the behavior of others. When Emily's initial reaction hurt me, I could have cut ties and walked away. But by reflecting on my expectations and addressing the issue calmly, I preserved a meaningful relationship. This approach aligns with the Stoic principle of acting wisely and justly, even when others fall short. The Stoics also emphasize that true compassion means tolerating imperfection in others while maintaining your own integrity. Setting boundaries doesn't mean shutting people out. It means creating space to protect your values without harboring resentment. When you encounter someone who seems to take others' worries lightly, ask yourself, am I assuming their intent? Could this be an opportunity to practice understanding and patience? By shifting the focus from judgment to growth, you not only strengthen the relationship, but also cultivate your own virtue. Finally, remember that relationships built on virtue are reciprocal. While it's important to show compassion and patience, it's equally important to foster connections where mutual respect allows both parties to grow. The Stoics encourage us to seek relationships that reflect shared humanity, where joy, sorrow, and understanding are exchanged freely, not measured transactionally, but rooted in goodwill. So, if you find yourself in a situation where someone dismisses your concerns, pause and reflect. Instead of reacting with hurt or frustration, approach the conversation with openness and reason. Use the moment as an opportunity to practice compassion and strengthen the bond, if possible. And if the relationship consistently undermines your peace or virtue, step away thoughtfully and without resentment. 4. Anyone who enforces their religious or political beliefs. As we've already discussed, none of us are exactly alike, and the diversity of thought, belief, and experience is what makes human relationships rich and meaningful. But it's also true that differences can sometimes lead to tension, especially when someone tries to impose their beliefs on you. Whether it's about politics, religion, or lifestyle, this kind of insistence can be exhausting and even feel like a personal attack. But the Stoics remind us to approach such situations with reason, patience, and a commitment to living virtuously, not by cutting ties in frustration or engaging in fruitless arguments, but by fostering understanding and goodwill. I experienced this with a close friend, Michael. Michael was deeply passionate about his beliefs, particularly his spiritual practices, and he often felt compelled to share them. At first, I appreciated his enthusiasm. It was part of what made him who he was. But as time went on, our conversations became less about connection and more about conversion. Every topic seemed to circle back to why I needed to adopt his way of thinking. At first, I tried to counter his points, defending my own perspective with as much conviction as he had for his. But these debates left me drained, frustrated, and feeling further from Michael, not closer. It wasn't until I revisited the teachings of the Stoics that I realized my approach was flawed. Epictetus reminds us that it is not the events themselves that disturb people, but their judgments about those events. Michael's insistence wasn't inherently harmful. It was my emotional reaction to it that created the tension. I was letting his behavior disrupt my peace because I felt the need to defend myself, to prove I was right. But what was I truly defending? My ego, not my principles. The Stoics teach us that disagreements, even persistent ones, should be met with calm reasoning and understanding. Instead of trying to change Michael's mind or win the conversation, I began to approach our discussions differently. The next time he brought up his beliefs, I listened patiently and without interrupting. When he finished, I calmly said, "I respect how much this means to you, and I can see why it brings you peace. For me, I've found different ways to live that align with what I value, and I hope you can respect that too." To my surprise, this approach shifted the dynamic. Michael didn't agree with me, but he didn't push back as much either. Over time, our conversations became less about convincing each other and more about sharing perspectives. I learned to let go of the need to be right and instead focused on maintaining mutual respect. The Stoics remind us that we cannot control how others behave. We can only control our responses. By staying calm and rooted in our principles, we can navigate disagreements without letting them escalate into conflicts. More importantly, cutting ties with someone over differences in belief often reflects a failure to act with patience and compassion. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, 'The people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they cannot distinguish between good and evil.'" This isn't a cynical view of humanity. It's a call to meet others' flaws with understanding, recognizing that their behavior often stems from ignorance or insecurity, not malice. But if someone's insistence consistently undermines your peace or makes it impossible to act virtuously, creating distance may be the wisest course. Yet, even then, Disengagement should be done without resentment or animosity. It's not about punishing the other person. It's about preserving your ability to live justly and wisely. Through my experience with Michael, I learned that harmony in relationships doesn't come from agreement, but from mutual respect. True connection isn't about changing someone else's beliefs. It's about accepting differences with equanimity and finding common ground where possible. By letting go of the need to always be right, I not only strengthened my friendship with Michael, but also cultivated a deeper sense of inner peace. 5. If you feel distressed when you meet a friend. Have you ever noticed that a relationship that once brought you so much joy now leaves you feeling a sense of unease or discomfort? It's a disconcerting realization, one that can make you question whether the connection is still worth holding on to. But the Stoics teach us that such moments are not reasons to cut ties impulsively. Instead, they are invitations to reflect, to approach relationships with gratitude and understanding, and to make decisions rooted in reason and virtue rather than emotional discomfort. I faced this challenge with a close friend from my university days, Daniel. In our younger years, we were inseparable. We spent countless hours discussing everything from philosophy to pop culture, sharing dreams of what our futures would look like. But as time passed, our paths diverged. I pursued a career that required long hours and frequent travel, while Daniel chose a quieter life in our hometown, focusing on local community work. When we met up years later, I was struck by how different we had become. Our conversations, once so fluid and energizing, now felt stilted and awkward. Daniel spoke passionately about projects I didn't fully understand, and I found myself rambling about work pressures that seemed foreign to him. I left that meeting feeling distressed, not because anything had gone wrong, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer in sync. At first, I considered stepping away from the friendship entirely, but the Stoic principles I had been studying urged me to pause and reflect. Relationships, after all, are part of the natural ebb and flow of life. Epictetus teaches us to focus on what is within our control, our actions, our goodwill, our ability to act justly. The fact that Daniel and I had grown apart wasn't something I could control, but how I responded to it was entirely within my power. Instead of dwelling on what we had lost, I chose to cherish what we had shared. Our friendship, even if it had evolved, was still a meaningful part of my life. I began to see our differences not as barriers, but as a reflection of the natural changes that come with time. When I next met Daniel, I approached the conversation with openness and curiosity, focusing on understanding his world rather than trying to recreate the connection we once had. To my surprise, this shift in perspective brought a sense of ease. Our friendship didn't return to its former rhythm, but it found a new, quieter harmony. The Stoics remind us that relationships don't have to remain static to remain valuable. Growing apart doesn't mean the bond is broken. It simply means the relationship has changed. By focusing on gratitude for the past and respect for the present, we can honor the connection without clinging to what it used to be. When I think about my friendship with Daniel now, I see it as a lesson in adaptability and goodwill. While we may never return to the closeness we once shared, I value the relationship for what it is, a testament to our shared history and a reminder that even as people change, respect and kindness can remain constant. If you find yourself in a similar situation, the Stoics offer guidance. Focus on what is within your control. Can you approach the relationship with understanding and patience? Can you adapt to its new form without forcing it into a mold that no longer fits? And if you choose to step back, can you do so with gratitude for the past and respect for the person rather than resentment or regret? Relationships, like life itself, are ever-changing. The Stoic response is not to cling to what was or to sever ties out of frustration, but to navigate these changes with grace and wisdom. By maintaining respect and goodwill, we honor the connection and allow both ourselves and the other person to grow authentically. And in doing so, we align our actions with the virtues of justice, kindness, and understanding, the true foundation of meaningful relationships. 6. Those who continue to complain about themselves. Ever felt like someone's constant complaints have turned you into their emotional landfill? A place where they unload every frustration, disappointment, or grievance, leaving you drained and overwhelmed. It's natural to feel exhausted in such situations, but the Stoics would urge us to pause and reflect before reacting with frustration or cutting ties. Instead of seeing such behavior as inherently toxic, they would encourage us to approach it with understanding, patience, and reason, while setting boundaries that protect our own well-being. I faced this challenge with a friend, Laura. Laura was a colleague I had known for years, someone I had always found lively and opinionated. But over time, her habit of complaining seemed to intensify. Every lunch break turned into a session where Laura vented about everything: her workload, her relationships, even the weather. At first, I tried to listen sympathetically, hoping that letting her speak would help her find clarity or relief. But it didn't. No matter how much I listened or tried to offer gentle suggestions, her complaints remained constant, and any attempts to shift the conversation towards something lighter or more balanced were ignored. One day, during a particularly stressful time in my life, I realized how much this dynamic was affecting me. I was dealing with a family health crisis and barely managing my own responsibilities. But Laura seemed oblivious. She continued to vent as if my challenges didn't exist. I considered cutting ties altogether, feeling resentful that she didn't recognize or respect my limits. But the Stoics teach us that such decisions should be made with reason, not emotion. Cutting someone off impulsively because their behavior feels draining risks fostering judgment and resentment, which Stoicism warns against. Instead, the Stoic approach is to reflect: why does this behavior affect me so strongly? What is within my control in this situation? How can I respond in a way that aligns with justice and kindness while protecting my peace? Yes, it's tough. Not everybody can think rationally in such situations, but it's effective. With this perspective in mind, I decided to address the issue calmly and rationally. The next time Laura began a long tirade, I listened for a moment and then gently interrupted. "Laura, I know you're going through a lot, and I want to be here for you, but right now I'm juggling some challenges of my own, and I don't have the emotional space to take on everything you're sharing. Can we focus on finding some solutions or talking about something lighter today?" At first, Laura was taken aback, and the conversation ended awkwardly. But over time, something surprising happened. She began to open up in a more constructive way, asking for advice rather than simply venting. Our relationship shifted from one-sided complaints to a more balanced exchange. By setting boundaries with kindness and honesty, I was able to protect my well-being without severing the connection entirely. By now, you should have a firm grasp on the Stoic directive of assessing your relationships with others when they start taking a toll. So, let me ask you, what would the Stoics say about setting boundaries with people who just can't stop complaining? Yes, that's right. Boundaries should be guided by reason, not resentment. If a relationship consistently hinders your ability to act with justice, moderation, or courage, stepping back may be necessary. But again, even then, the decision should be made with goodwill, ensuring the other person understands that your choice is about preserving balance, not rejecting them. Through my experience with Laura, I learned that relationships don't have to be perfect to be valuable. By approaching her complaints with patience and setting boundaries with care, I not only protected my own well-being, but also helped shift the dynamic towards something healthier. The Stoic lesson is clear. It's not about rejecting others or labeling them as toxic. It's about finding a balance where mutual respect allows both parties to thrive. When you respond to others' struggles with empathy while maintaining your own integrity, you cultivate relationships that reflect the virtues of justice, kindness, and wisdom, strengthening both your connections and your inner peace. 7. People who take promises lightly or break them easily. Have you ever been left waiting, only to realize that someone who made a promise to you has completely forgotten or broken it? Maybe they offered a casual apology or no explanation at all, leaving you feeling hurt or undervalued. It's easy to take such moments personally, to feel like their actions reflect a lack of care or respect. But the Stoics remind us to step back, temper our expectations, and see the situation through the lens of reason and virtue, rather than emotional hurt. I had a friend, let's call him Alex, who was notorious for making promises he didn't keep. Whether it was meeting up for coffee, helping with a project, or even small favors, Alex often fell through. One time, after we'd planned a dinner to celebrate a personal milestone of mine, Alex simply didn't show up. Hours later, I got a brief text. "Sorry, something came up." Rain check? It wasn't the first time this had happened, and I found myself simmering with frustration. Did he not value my time? Did our friendship mean so little to him? Initially, like an unwise person, I considered distancing myself entirely. It felt easier to walk away than to address the pattern of broken promises. But Stoicism offered me a different approach. Marcus Aurelius's advice on meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly people came to mind, something we touched upon earlier. At that time, it served as a call to meet others' flaws with understanding, recognizing that their actions are often shaped by their own struggles, distractions, or ignorance rather than deliberate malice. When I reflected on Alex's behavior, I realized his broken promises weren't about me, they were about him. He wasn't intentionally trying to hurt me. He was juggling a chaotic life, often overcommitting without thinking. My frustration stemmed not from his actions, but from my own expectations. I had attached my sense of worth to his ability to keep his word, placing my peace of mind in something beyond my control. Instead of cutting ties impulsively, I decided to address the issue with patience and goodwill. The next time we spoke, I said, "Alex, I value our friendship, but I've noticed a pattern that's been hard for me. When plans fall through or promises aren't kept, it feels like my time or the things we've planned don't matter. Can we find a way to be clearer about commitments moving forward?" To my surprise, Alex responded with genuine remorse. He admitted that he often made plans in the moment without considering whether he could follow through and promised to be more mindful. While his behavior didn't change overnight, our conversation strengthened our connection. By addressing the issue constructively rather than reacting emotionally, I preserved a friendship that was still meaningful despite its flaws. The Stoics teach us that relationships are opportunities to practice virtues like patience, forgiveness, and justice. Yet, had Alex's broken promises continued without any effort to improve, the Stoics would have advised choosing to create distance, not as punishment, but as a way to protect my own ability to live wisely and peacefully. Remember, step away, but with goodwill, not resentment. Relationships that falter or fade are not failures, but part of the natural flow of life. Cherish the positive moments they brought and let go with gratitude rather than bitterness. Through my experience with Alex, I learned that broken promises don't have to break relationships. By approaching the situation with understanding and addressing it constructively, I preserved a meaningful connection while maintaining my own peace. 8. People who keep talking about the same worries. Ever found yourself in a conversation that feels like déjà vu, listening to the same worries and complaints on repeat, offering advice that seems to fall on deaf ears? It's easy to grow frustrated or drained, wondering if the relationship is worth the effort. But Stoicism teaches us a deeper, more compassionate perspective. When someone repeatedly shares their worries, it's not always about avoiding solutions. Often it's about habit, fear, or simply the comfort of being heard. Instead of judging their behavior or cutting ties, the Stoics would encourage us to see this as an opportunity to practice patience, kindness, and humility while maintaining our own tranquility. I experienced this with a close friend, Emma. For years, Emma struggled with dissatisfaction at work. Every time we met, she'd vent about the same issues: unfair treatment, lack of recognition, and a general sense of being stuck. At first, I was eager to help, offering practical advice like updating her resume, seeking mentorship, or even considering a career change. But no matter what suggestions I gave, Emma always found reasons why they wouldn't work. Our conversations became a loop, and I started to feel like a broken record, repeating advice that never seemed to stick. My initial reaction was frustration. Why was she coming to me if she wasn't willing to act on my advice? Was I just enabling her by listening? I considered distancing myself, feeling like the dynamic was becoming one-sided. But then I paused and reflected on what Stoicism teaches us about relationships and expectations. Epictetus reminds us that it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. The problem wasn't Emma's repetitive worries. It was my attachment to the outcome of her actions. With this shift in perspective, I approached our next conversation differently. Instead of feeling responsible for solving Emma's problems, I focused on being present and offering support without attachment. When she brought up the same concerns, I listened patiently and said, "Emma, I hear how much this is weighing on you. Have you thought about what small steps you could take to start improving things?" She responded with the usual excuses, but this time I didn't push back or try to convince her. I simply said, "I'm here for you, but I believe that any change has to come from you. When you're ready, I'll help in any way I can." This shift not only eased my frustration, but also gave Emma space to reflect without feeling pressured. Over time, she began taking small steps to address her situation. Not because I forced her to, but because I allowed her the freedom to act when she was ready. The Stoics remind us that our role in relationships is not to control others, but to act virtuously, offering support and wisdom without being consumed by frustration or disappointment when our advice isn't immediately followed. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself." This means practicing patience and compassion with others' struggles while maintaining clarity and discipline in your own actions. Through my experience with Emma, I learned that relationships are not about fixing others, but about creating space for growth, both theirs and yours. By releasing my attachment to how she handled her struggles, I preserved our friendship and found greater peace in my role as a supportive listener. The Stoic approach to such situations emphasizes balance, offering kindness without overextending yourself, practicing patience without enabling unproductive patterns, and maintaining boundaries without resentment. 9. People who boast excessively. Have you ever had a conversation with someone who constantly steers it toward their past achievements? Perhaps it's an old award, a professional success, or an exciting adventure they once had. At first, you might admire their stories or even find them inspiring. But as the pattern repeats, you begin to notice a deeper truth. Their focus on the past seems less about sharing joy and more about clinging to an identity they no longer feel connected to. I experienced this with a friend, Mark. Mark had once been at the pinnacle of his career, earning accolades and recognition that few could rival. When I first got to know him, I was captivated by his stories. They were filled with vibrant details and moments of triumph. But over time, I realized that every conversation inevitably circled back to those same stories, and any attempt to discuss the present was met with a quick redirection. For example, I once asked him what projects he was currently excited about. He hesitated, then launched into another tale about an award he'd received years ago. It became clear that Mark's pride in his past masked a discomfort with his present, a life that, by his own standards, no longer felt remarkable. At first, I felt frustrated, even annoyed. Why couldn't he just let go and focus on what was happening now? But Stoicism taught me to pause and reflect, to approach Mark's behavior with understanding rather than judgment. The Stoics remind us that boasting often stems from insecurity, nostalgia, or a lack of purpose in the present, not arrogance or malice. Mark's repeated focus on his past wasn't a reflection of who he was at his core. It was a response to his own internal struggles. Instead of letting frustration guide my actions, I chose to see his behavior as an opportunity to practice virtues like patience, compassion, and humility. During one of our conversations, I decided to gently steer the discussion in a new direction. When he began recounting yet another past achievement, I said, "Mark, I can see how much these moments meant to you. They're incredible stories. But I'd love to hear about what excites you today. What are you looking forward to?" At first, he seemed taken aback, but with a bit of encouragement, he opened up about a small gardening project he'd started at home. It wasn't a grand tale, but it was genuine and grounded in his present life. Over time, these conversations became more balanced, focusing less on past glories and more on the here and now. The Stoics teach us that relationships are opportunities to embody virtue. Instead of distancing ourselves from someone who boasts excessively, we can choose to engage with them in ways that foster connection and growth. By redirecting conversations with kindness and curiosity, we can help them find meaning in the present without diminishing their feelings or invalidating their past. But, and it's an important but, if the conversations and interactions become repetitive or draining, which they sure do, it's also important to set boundaries that protect our well-being while acting justly and compassionately. For instance, if Mark had continued to deflect any attempt at meaningful engagement, I might have chosen to limit our interactions, not out of frustration, but with the understanding that relationships should support mutual growth and respect. And so, through my experience with Mark, I learned that relationships are not about expecting perfection from others, but about navigating imperfections with grace. By choosing to understand rather than judge, I not only preserved our friendship, but also helped him rediscover value in the present. The Stoic lesson is clear. Instead of cutting ties with someone who boasts excessively, approach them with empathy and a focus on your own actions. By practicing patience and fostering meaningful dialogue, you not only maintain your tranquility, but also create an opportunity to guide them toward a more fulfilling outlook. True kindness lies not in retreating from others' struggles, but in meeting them with understanding and support, aligning your actions with the virtues of justice, humility, and benevolence. I'll repeat what I said earlier. The true measure of our character isn't how we act when relationships are easy, it's how we respond when they challenge us. So, before you walk away from a relationship that's testing your limits, pause, reflect. Let the Stoics guide you to a decision that aligns not just with your emotions, but with your highest self. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear this. Let's strive to live better, more respectful lives. Until next time, stay strong and stay stoic.